Next, let's talk a bit about the cost to develop serverless. And there's a lot of myths and untruths and things here that I want to cover. So I actually did a bit of research. I created a project brief. And it was a very simple project. It was a registration form and some information had to be filled out, had to be submitted and processed. The design aspect didn't matter. And I did two versions of this. One was server-based and one was serverless. And for both of these, I was quite specific. I didn't want to leave too much to the imagination or creative input. It was quite clear what needed to be done for those. The scope was clear, many of the technology and the architectural choices had been made. And we sent this to 160 different vendors. And this was a mix of vendors that specialized in serverless, so they were very experienced with it. It was vendors that had no experience with serverless, and they were doing server-based. And we sent them both briefs to see what they would do. And we also had some vendors that were bigger or SMEs, development agencies, and some were freelancers. So it was a good mix. And we gave them different briefs to get different sort of data points, and we talked to them to get more insights. And we found that serverless development is generally more expensive. We were not terribly surprised by this. And it's important to see why that is. So serverless specialized vendors, like development agencies that do serverless, they know that they're a rarity. And their unique selling point and their advantage is that they will do things incredibly fast. So their time estimates are actually very low. So the timelines that they had to develop the solution were incredibly short, but their costs were higher. They had a much higher rate per hour. And this just comes down to that they know they're a minority, as it were. There's not that many that are that experienced yet. So they know they can charge a premium for their services. Because as I mentioned before as well, serverless goes hand in hand with good DevOps practices. Things like automated deployment, reusable deployment, testing, automation testing, all of this is in place with these type of vendors. So you get high quality at a very fast pace, but at a much higher price point. And on the less experienced side, their serverless estimates were also higher because they expected a learning curve. They expected to make mistakes and have to iterate and change things. And their timelines were also much longer for the serverless ones compared to the serverless because it's new to them. And they were willing to learn, they were interested in learning, but it was going to take more time. And these are really the two sort of crucial insights that we had around price. Like, you can have something that is fast to develop and that, technically speaking, per hour, that should be a low cost. But the actual cost will always be driven by market forces. You know, people that know that they deliver quality, that are very capable in a certain need that you may have, they will charge more, and rightfully so in many cases. Some of the other insights that we had is that it is actually difficult to find serverless vendors. The Amazon partner site has links to vendors that are serverless capable. That makes it a bit easier. But our 160 vendors was definitely skewed more towards those that were not experienced with serverless. But I'm okay with that in this particular research because I think it reflects the market and it's what you would also experience if you went out looking for a vendor. The study also gives some other interesting insights where I think the division of work was quite interesting with the server-based brief. The estimates that we got, they were like 50% around development, 50% around everything else. So doing the deployment, doing the configuration, things like that. Whereas with serverless, it was 80 to 90% actual development, 10 to 20% was the rest. And again, this comes back to the experienced vendors having these automated deployment pipelines in place. Some of the less experienced vendors with serverless also gave us some interesting reasons as to why their price was what it was. One that kept popping up is that the vendors would almost complain that they didn't want it to do it serverless because that would mean that they would have to configure all these little individual services and that would take much more time. And again, this is just indicative of them not having these deployment pipelines to automate that kind of process. All of this can be automated with good DevOps practices, which is really crucial.